There is a 2-week stretch every June when your perennial garden either gets set up for the rest of the summer or it does not. Once the first true heat wave hits in early July, the window has closed for the entire year. Beds that get the right work this week look magnificent through August. Beds that skip this week start declining by the second week of July, develop the diseases that no later spray can really reverse, and stop blooming at the exact moment summer is supposed to peak. 9 tasks, one specific perennial behind each one. 40 years in my own trial garden show that almost every gardener I have met handles task number 1, wrong every single June, and pays for it with the second bloom they never get. Refresh every perennial bed edge in your garden with a half-moon edger before the grass takes the boundary back entirely. A half-moon edger is the tool that few American gardeners under 50 have ever held. It is a flat half circle of steel on a long wooden handle used to cut a clean vertical face at the boundary between lawn and perennial bed. One swing of the edger drops the soil 2 to 3 inches deeper than the lawn line and resets the bed boundary entirely. Every grass root that spent April through May creeping under the mulch into the bed gets cleanly severed. The mulch line snaps back to sharp. The whole bed reads as 10 years younger from across the yard. Specific plant example, the shade bed under the maple tree. By June, lawn grass has typically pushed 12 to 18 inches into a shade bed where the edge was crisp at the start of April. A single afternoon with a half-moon edger pulls the line back to its original shape, severs the creeping invasion, and creates the clean, dark frame that makes every plant inside the bed visually pop. The hostas, the heuchera, the bleeding heart. Every plant looks better than it did the day before, with not a single plant change made. What to do? Find a half-moon edger at any old line hardware store or local rental yard for about $25. Cut along the lawn edge of every bed in early morning while the soil is still slightly damp from overnight dew. The cut goes cleaner through damp soil than through dry. 3 inches deep, vertical face toward the bed, gentle, natural curves following the bed's existing shape. Mulch right up to the cut. 40 years in the trial garden, the half-moon edge is the single most dramatic transformation a perennial bed gets in one Saturday morning. Better return on the time than any fertilizer, any mulch, or any single plant purchase the garden center has on the rack. Switch to deep morning watering before July arrives. The most damaging routine in American perennial gardening is daily light watering with the hose. It feels responsible. The gardener is out there every day doing the work, but light surface watering only wets the top inch or so of soil. Established perennial roots sit deeper than that, anywhere from a hand's depth to a 1.5 feet below the surface, depending on the species. The shallow water never reaches them. Worse, the plant responds to chronic shallow watering by sending more roots up toward the wet zone at the surface, where they are most exposed to heat and drought stress in July. Specific plant example, garden phlox, the classic powdery mildew victim. A phlox bed watered in the evening with a sprinkler that wets the foliage stays damp through the night. Mildew spores establish within 3 nights. By mid-July, the lower leaves are gray-white and the plant is in visible decline. The same phlox bed watered at the soil line base of the plant in early morning, slow and deep twice a week, comes through August clean. What to do? Aim for about 1 inch of water per week, broken into 2 long soaks rather than 7 quick ones. Apply slowly enough that water penetrates rather than runs off. A useful test is this. Set an empty soup or vegetable can in the spray zone of your sprinkler. When the can is full, the bed has received its inch. Always water in the early morning, never at sunset. Foliage that gets wet in the morning dries off in the heat of the day and gives the fungal spores nothing to work with. Foliage that stays wet through the night is exactly where powdery mildew, black spot, and the related summer fungal diseases all establish. 40 years in the trial garden confirms it. The beds I watered correctly in June carry through August clean. The beds where the morning got away from me and I picked up the hose at 6 in the evening are the beds with mildew problems by mid-July. Mulch every perennial bed to 4 inches before the first major heat wave of July. And if you have access to compost, work 1 inch of that under the mulch first. Mulch in a perennial bed is not decorative. It is the single most effective working layer between your plants and the July heat, a water holding cap, a soil temperature buffer, and a weed barrier in one move. 4 inches of shredded bark, straw, or wood chip mulch cut surface evaporation by something like 2.3 to 3.4. The deep, weekly watering you set up previously goes roughly twice as far under that mulch layer, and the soil holds steady moisture between waterings instead of swinging from wet to bone dry. The compost angle is the bonus most gardeners skip. An inch of finished compost worked into the soil surface around every perennial clump before the mulch goes down replaces every reason to buy a bag of synthetic fertilizer for the rest of the summer. The Chicago Botanic Garden runs their perennial display gardens on exactly this protocol. Compost top dress in June. No purchase fertilizer the rest of the year. Specific plant example, Heuchera, the shallow-rooted favorite. Heuchera roots sit in the top 2 to 4 inches of soil. In a bed without mulch, the surface temperature on a 95-degree July afternoon hits 120 degrees. The root zone cooks, the plant declines or dies outright. The same Heuchera in a bed with an inch of compost under 4 inches of mulch sits in soil that stays in the 70s, even on the hottest day, with steady, gentle feeding from the compost layer through August. What to do? Source bulk, shredded hardwood mulch from your local bulk yard rather than bagged from the chain. Half the price per cubic yard breaks down into the soil within 2 seasons. No dyes. Apply 4 inches across every perennial bed. Keep mulch pulled back 2 inches from the actual stem of every plant because mulch piled against the crown invites rot and pest harborage. Beds with compost plus mulch by the last week of June are the beds I never water in August and never fertilize the rest of the year. Drop your state and your USDA zone in the comments. Every task on this list applies a little differently depending on where you are in the country and how far along your perennials are right now. Chelsea, chop your fall blooming perennials right now to get shorter, stronger, more abundant flowers in September, and no need to stake any of them later. The Chelsea chop is a technique imported from English gardening. Pinch back the soft new growth on fall blooming perennials by 1 to 3 to 1 to 2 during the last week of May or the first 3 weeks of June. The plant responds by branching at every cut point, producing more flower buds along a shorter, more compact, self-supporting stem. The September bloom is denser, more colorful, and never flops in a heavy autumn rain. Specific plant example, tall sedum autumn joy. Without the Chelsea chop, the plant reaches 3 ft tall by September. The heavy flower heads play outward. The center opens like a broken umbrella, and the gardener spends October propping up flop stems with bamboo. Chelsea chopped in mid-June. The same plant stays at 24 to 30 inches, branches densely from every cut, holds vertical through November, and produces twice as many of the dusty pink flower clusters. What to do? Cut back the soft top growth by 1 to 3 for moderate effect, or 1 to 2 for stronger compaction on these fall bloomers anytime in the next 3 weeks. Tall sedum, asters, New England and New York types, helenium, monarda or bee balm, Joe Pye weed, autumn anemone, and tall garden phlox where height is a problem. Use bypass pruners, cut just above a healthy leaf node. The plant looks naked for 10 to 14 days. By mid-July, the regrowth is denser than the original. By September, every cut node produces more flowers than the uncut plant would have. The Chelsea chop is the single most underused technique in American perennial gardening. The English garden writers taught it generations ago. American garden centers never put it on the staff training sheet. Walk every perennial bed this week with a careful eye for pests and early disease before the heat of July multiplies both. The reason June scouting matters is mechanical. Warm temperatures accelerate the reproduction cycle of every insect pest and fungal pathogen already present in the garden. An aphid colony of 20 insects on a catnip leaf this week becomes hundreds per leaf within 10 days of summer heat. A small patch of powdery mildew at the base of a phlox stem in June covers the whole plant by mid-July. Caught at the June stage, every problem is small, local, and reversible with a single short intervention. Caught at the July stage, every problem is widespread and difficult to roll back. Specific plant example, catnip. the single most aphid-prone perennial in most American gardens. Flip a catnip leaf this week. If you count fewer than 20 aphids per leaf, a strong blast of water from the hose repeated 3 days in a row clears them entirely. Wait 2 weeks and you have a sticky leaf surface with ants farming the colony. The catnip stops blooming and you are reaching for chemical intervention you did not need to use. What to do? Walk every perennial bed in early morning this week with a flashlight if you have to. Flip leaves over and look at the undersides. Aphids, spider mite webbing, and fungal spores all establish on leaf undersides first before the gardener can see anything from above. Check the soil line base of every stem for slug-chewed ragged holes that have no visible insect during the day. Slugs feed at night and retreat to mulch by dawn. The preventative spray that holds fungal pressure down through summer, 1 TBSP of 3% hydrogen peroxide mixed into a quart of water, applied as a fine mist to all leaf surfaces in early morning once a week. The peroxide oxidizes fungal spores on contact and leaves no residue. Catch the problem at the leaf level in June, manage it in days. Wait until July and you are managing for the rest of summer. Divide every perennial clump that has stopped blooming as vigorously as it used to. A perennial that has been crowding itself for several seasons stops putting on a real bloom. The biology is straightforward. Once the root mass packs into the available soil tightly enough, the older crown in the middle of the clump runs out of nutrient access and begins dying back while the plant pushes whatever vigor it has out to the younger outer ring. Flower production drops with a central dieback. Most American gardeners only notice this when their coneflower or daylily clump produces visibly fewer blooms than the year before, by which point the clump has been overcrowded for 2 summers. Specific plant example, Stelladoro daylily, the classic Mid-Atlantic foundation planting. A 3-year-old Stella clump that started as a single nursery pot is now 8 to 10 distinct crowns wedged together. Dig the whole clump, tease it apart at the natural crown divisions. You will get 8 to 10 free plants from one clump, 8 to 10 times the $15 nursery price. A morning of dividing pays for a year of garden investment. What to do? Water the clump deeply the day before dividing. A turgid plant handles division stress dramatically better than a dry one. Dig the entire clump, lift it cleanly, look at the crown structure. Each viable division needs at minimum 1 healthy crown with active root mass attached. Replant immediately, water deeply, mulch to retain moisture. Expect some wilting in the first 3 to 5 days. Established new growth within 2 to 3 weeks confirms a successful division. Perennials that benefit from June division include daylilies, hostas, coneflowers, black-eyed Susan, bee balm, asters, and catmint. Every viable division is essentially a free new plant, and the nursery price for any of those at the local garden center sits between $12 and $20 apiece. A single Saturday morning of dividing across a mature perennial garden routinely produces $150 to $300 of plants you would otherwise have to buy. That is the kind of return on time that nothing else in the June garden touches. Stake every tall perennial in your garden now before the first heavy June thunderstorm puts them all on the ground. The peony problem is the textbook case. The plant blooms in early June with heads the size of grapefruits. The first heavy rain after bloom, and June rains are dependable, will put every peony stem on the grass in a tangle the gardener cannot lift back up without breaking. The cage you needed to install in May, you needed in May. Installed now in late June, the peony is already leaning. Specific plant example. Peony, the single most understaked perennial in American gardens. Old American peony beds from the 1940s had wire grow-through hoops installed every spring when the foliage was 6 inches tall. The hoop sits over the emerging plant and the foliage grows up through the gridded support. The bloom that follows holds vertical no matter what June throws at it. What to do for the peonies you already have? Install grow-through cages or hoops as soon as the foliage is up, early to mid-May ideally, but install them today even if the bloom is half over. The cage prevents further damage on the second wave of bloom and on the foliage for the rest of the season. Same protocol for delphinium. 6 FT bamboo stakes with garden twine in a figure-8 tie. Garden phlox needs no individual staking if planted in a dense block where stems support each other. After years of watching gardeners discover this problem in June, the lesson holds. Stake now or do not stake at all. The plant either gets vertical support or it goes horizontal. Once it is on the ground, the season is over for that plant. Cut back specific perennials immediately after their first flush of bloom and force a second bloom most gardeners never get. Several perennials most gardeners assume are one flush only performers actually produce a full second bloom when cut back hard immediately after their first flush ends. The technique is brutal looking and contrary to every instinct. It works. Specific plant example, Salvia Maynight, the reliable mid-spring purple spike bloomer. By mid-June, the spikes are spent and the plant looks ragged. Cut the entire spent flower mass back by 2-3 the moment the last spike is finished. Not the bloom mound, the spent flower spikes. The plant looks bare for 10 to 14 days. A complete second flush of spikes arrives 4 to 6 weeks later. The second bloom is often heavier than the first. What to do for the other rebloomers? Catmint, shear the entire plant back by half. It looks brutal for 10 days, then comes back heavier than the first flush. Delphinium, cut the spent flower spike back to the basal foliage, and a second set of shorter spikes emerges by late summer. Hardy geranium, shear back hard after first bloom for a fresh round of foliage, plus a partial second bloom. Coreopsis moonbeam, shear the spent bloom mat back by 1-3 for an extended second flush. The rule, cut immediately after the last bloom on the last stem finishes. Do not wait until the plant looks bad. Do not wait until you can fit it into your schedule. The plant's energy redirects fastest when the cut is fresh. Comment June below if you still have time this week to do these tasks, and which of the 9 is the one you always forget? Divide, mulch, stake, edge, Chelsea chop, or deadhead? I read every comment. The pattern in those answers shapes the next preseason checklist. The task almost every American gardener does wrong every single June and pays for it with a second bloom they never get. The instinct most gardeners use is to pinch off the dead-looking flower head between thumb and finger and toss it aside. The bed looks tidier for an afternoon. The plant has not actually been deadheaded in any way that helps it. The technique that triggers a second flush works on a different principle. Find the next pair of healthy leaves down the stem from the spent bloom, usually 2 to 4 inches below. Cut the stem at that exact point with garden snips. The plant reads the cut as a signal to push the lateral buds at that node into bloom production. New flowers develop in 4 to 6 weeks. Specific plant example, coneflower. Trim each spent bloom stem down to the next pair of leaves below, never at the bloom itself. A second flush of smaller but vivid blooms arrives by late July. Same protocol works for black-eyed Susan, garden phlox, and most repeat blooming American perennials. That is the deadheading that chain garden centers never bothered to teach customers to do. 9 checkpoints in one calendar window. Skip any of them, and July punishes the bed. Hit all of them, and your perennial garden carries the rest of the summer without you having to chase it. Half moon edge, deep morning water, compost plus mulch, Chelsea chop the fall bloomers, pest scout with a flashlight, divide for the free plants, stake before the storm, cut back for the second bloom, and the deadhead cut almost nobody bothers to make correctly. The summer garden takes care of itself once those 9 are in. 40 years confirms it. If these strategies change the way you look at your summer garden, please subscribe and like the channel. We are digging deep into the gardening secrets that often go overlooked. Let's grow a better future together. Our next garden treasure will be revealed soon.